Hello and welcome back to Pod Sequentialism, recorded here at Meltdown Comics and Collectibles, presented also by the Pop Sequentialism website and blog. I am your host, Matt Kennedy, and I want to introduce everybody who doesn't already know to my good friend Howard Hallis, who, aside from being one of the world authorities on the character Doctor Strange, is also a fine artist, an exhibiting artist, comes out of that great UCLA world that had people like Chris Burden, Paul McCarthy, and Howard was actually responsible for setting up the video camera that captured Timothy Leary's ultimate demise.
I didn't put the video camera there, but I was there when Dr. Leary passed away. I was one of the few people in the room, and it's very strange seeing someone actually die. And I guess in the Harry Potter world, I could see Thestrals now, but no, it was a fascinating experience, and we should all be so lucky to pass away in your own home, surrounded by friends and family, and get a standing ovation right after they pronounce you dead, which is what happened with Tim. So it was quite a moving and beautiful experience. I was very lucky to be there.
And with that Harry Potter reference, we get into what the theme of today's show is going to be, and it's going to be the presentation of magic. We're talking about magic with a CK at the end, ritual magic, and how it relates to comic books, how comic books have handled the presentation of ritual and occult magic, and when they've gotten it right and when they've gotten it wrong. And I figured that a great person to have that conversation with would be Howard.
Yes, I've read a lot of comic books about ritual magic, so yes, indeed. I mean, I guess you could say that Grant Morrison and Alan Moore are really the main modern proponents of ritual magic in comics.
Definitely chaos magic.
Yeah, and funny enough, Doctor Strange, in a very late issue of the first Avengers series, I think it was issue 503, after the Scarlet Witch goes crazy, someone says, well, she was a practitioner of chaos magic, and Doctor Strange said, there is no such thing as chaos magic. So, at least in the Marvel Universe, according to Bendis, there is no such thing as chaos magic.
Do you think that's his admission to not knowing much about the subject in the face of how much press has surrounded people like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore and their very open discussion about it, or maybe an attempt to be like, hey, what we do here, this is a good, clean, wholesome superhero fun, and we don't want to get involved in that other thing?
Well, Marvel's gotten involved at least peripherally, but I think that most of the Marvel superheroes have their origin stories based on science. Either they're irradiated with some kind of radiation or they're genetic mutations. There's not a lot of mysticism in the Marvel universe outside of Doctor Strange and maybe... Yeah,
Ghost Rider.
But even those, they're monsters. They're mutations that Blade goes after. Ghost Rider, I guess, goes into the mythos of, hell being a real place and him getting his powers from the devil. And of course, in the early issues, there's a Jesus character that appears. So yeah, there is a few mystical characters that Marvel has used, but I think since the movies have started coming out, they've really gravitated toward the scientific explanation for these powers. And it'll be interesting when the Doctor Strange movie comes out to see how they handle the mysticism element.
It does seem like the golden age, which in this case would actually be the Bronze Age, of Marvel's attention to even the occult, really, comes and goes with Marv Wolfman. That Marv Wolfman, being a writer on some of the early 70s titles like Tomb of Dracula, was also a frequent contributor to Marvel Spotlight, which helped launch the characters Son of Satan. Blade came out of Marvel Spotlight, I believe, as well, or Marvel Premiere. And the Dracula character and Morpheus the Vampire, that all of these creations seem to be from that particular era of comics, the early 70s, mid 70s. But I think that there was sort of a national interest in gothic horror. Certainly Dark Shadows was on television as a soap opera, and it could have been just a part of the general zeitgeist. Now, in talking about chaos magic and how it relates to comics, the work of Grant Morrison is such meta writing that the zeitgeist is seemingly the guiding hand of his cosmic view.
Yeah, he's brought a lot of that kind of element into DC Comics, and a lot of it was from his own experiences. Meeting
on the Invisibles and the spaceship. If anybody's familiar with what Grant has talked about,
right? He was, I think he was in Nepal somewhere, and he had all of these out of body transcendent experiences that he brought directly into.
I think it's Kashmir.
Yes, or Kathmandu.
Kathmandu.
It's Kathmandu. Yes. There we go. Okay, we got it. It's one of those. But yeah, he had that spiritual awakening and saw all of these interdimensional beings, some of whom were not very nice, and he brought all these into the Invisibles. And yeah, that definitely was, that in the 90s, that really, he was basically the Alan Moore of the 90s, bringing that chaos magic element into the comics.
Yeah, Alan Moore was in for a good deal of the 90s in a kind of reclusive retirement that
wasn't Promethea the 90s too, though?
Promethea, late 90s, maybe early 2000s. Most of Alan Moore's focus in the 90s was at Image, where the 1963 universe that Steve Bissett and Rick Veitch put together with Alan Moore, and that will never be republished because they can't get Alan Moore to sign off on a republication of it.
Didn't Neil Gaiman do one of the books for that as well?
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
I remember that.
And Alan had been brought in to write for Spawn, as had Neil Gaiman. And, then through Top Cow, I think they were publishing League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, which took a very long time to become a regular kind of comic again. But, definitely in that interim, you had Grant Morrison doing his turn on Animal Man, which became a very meta self-referential comic where he became a character in that comic book as well.
Right, and also the Doom Patrol stuff he did.
Which is so crazy, so Dada-esque, as people were fond of saying.
Danny the Street. I like how he had an entire street as a character, and it could appear anywhere and take you anywhere. It was very, very imaginative. I like his idea of hyper time as well. He brought in a lot of quantum physics into the DC universe. He's an interesting guy, that Grant Morrison.
Well, we've talked about some of the recent guys. I think it's a good chance to take a break right here for a second. Before we dive back into time, we're going to hear a little word from one or two of our sponsors. But we'll be right back with Howard Hallis. You're listening to Pod Sequentialism.
Hey guys, it's Briars. Just want to tell you what's going on down at Meltdown Comics in Hollywood. We got Meltthology. Meltthology is a monthly comics jam at Meltdown every third Tuesday of the month. Here's how it works. Show up at the Melt at 7 p.m. and draw a page of whatever you want. At 9:30 p.m., we'll collect all of the art and $3 for printing costs. When you come to the next month's comics jam, you'll get a zine with everyone's contributions inside. There is no set theme, and all skill levels are welcome. Last but not least, Meltthology contributors get 10% off their Meltdown purchase on the night of the event. Go to @Meltthology on Twitter or Facebook if you have any specific questions. Ask for Chuck, and that is @Melt_thology.
Welcome back to Pod Sequentialism. I am your host, Matt Kennedy. We're here with Howard Hallis, great authority on Doctor Strange, but also on the history of mysticism in comics. And in the first part of the program, we talked a little bit about, I guess you could say, the state of the black arts as they relate in comics with people like Grant Morrison and Alan Moore. But let's go back to the beginning. At what point did the idea of like real, maybe Crowleyan mysticism start to enter the comic book medium?
Well, I know that there were a lot of pulps that came out around the time of Aleister Crowley being alive that purported to have, characters stumbling into occult rituals, breaking them up, superheroes finding a woman about to be sacrificed to the devil and all of this.
The Typhonian tradition, I think, is a great subject out of one of Peter Levenda's books, where he talks about Aleister Crowley and H.P. Lovecraft writing about the exact same things on the exact same dates, because Crowley kept copious notes with his letters, and all the stories that H.P. Lovecraft wrote have dates, written into the actual stories. And I guess you have the other British magician, is it Kenneth
Anger?
No, Kenneth Anger's American, but a different. Oh my gosh, this is going to torture me. But the number one proponent of the Typhonian tradition is this other English writer, and he seems to be the guy that was able to connect the two in a at least somewhat arbitrary way. That maybe there was more to it. And I know that Levenda's book is, I think it's called The Beast. It really explores those. But talk to a little bit about those other pulps that were out there.
Well, I know there were radio stories as well as the pulps, like Chandu the Mystic, which Stan Lee says is one of his primary inspirations for Doctor Strange. There's always been the idea of the superhero magician from the pulp times, but in comics you could look at Dr. Fate from the 1940s, before they turned him into a superhero and had him fighting alongside the rest of the Justice Society of America. In his first few issues in more fun comics, they had him as, they had all of this Egyptian mythology, and they've since brought that back in when they've revamped the character a few times. But this was back in the 40s, the first appearance of Dr. Fate. He actually goes and meets God and is bestowed with not only this helmet with arcane occult powers, but, he has all of this Egyptian mythology following him. And, as you know from Crowley, he had his honeymoon in the Great Pyramid, and, there was a lot of that in that character. And there were various other occult superheroes to follow, but really I think the next major one was probably Doctor Strange in 63, I guess, or 64. And it was it's not, it was still seen as more of the fantastic, not really bringing it into actual reality in these early Marvel comics. I think it was only after Steve Englehart and Frank Brunner started writing the character in the 70s that some real occult mysticism stuff came out of that, because they were involved in that sort of thing. And I know there's a particular issue of Marvel Premiere, number 14, where Doctor Strange and Baron Mordo follow this super magical being named Callistrogo, also used in League of Extraordinary Gentlemen and a few other things. It's based on the alter ego of some 18th century magician fellow. I forgot his name at the moment. But anyways, they follow him through time till he goes all the way back to the Big Bang. And as Callistrogo is going through time, he's absorbing all of the magical energy of all of these eras till finally, at the end of the comic, he becomes God and explodes, and he is the Big Bang. Yeah. And only Doctor Strange and Mordo have witnessed this whole thing taking place. And they even say, like, he needs time to come down, like he's coming off of some crazy acid trip. And I think that when Brunner and Englehart were doing that stuff, they were basing it on certain ritualistic experiences that they were doing when they weren't in the Marvel offices. Whereas I think Stan Lee and Ditko and Kirby, although they had these sensibilities and these wild imagination, all of this was great in developing all these characters. It wasn't really based on actual ritual magic in the same way.
And I know that that Frank Bruno was a regular at the Magical Child, which was one of the most famous occult shops in the world. It was in New York City. I believe it was in Manhattan. And if anybody is looking for a great documentary on similar subjects, Fangoria magazine started to issue some home videos in the 80s. The first was a video on Tom Savini and about makeup special effects. And the second one was sort of a real head scratcher for Fangoria because it was a documentary about Satanism and witchcraft. And they talk about the history of the concepts of both of Satan as shaitan and adversary. And they really go down through the treatment of the devil in pop culture, and before pop culture was pop culture, when it was just culture. And they interview the original owner of Magical Child, who was still alive at the time. And he talks about an actual war of magicians that took place on the streets of Manhattan in the early 1970s. And the people who hung out at that shop, a lot of them were comic book writers or fantasy writers. And
I think Marv Wolfman as well.
Yeah, Marv Wolfman, ironically named. And one of my favorite writers of comics. I would put his Teen Titans up against Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men, and 9 times out of 10, I preferred the stories that were in the Perez and Wolfman Teen Titans.
And don't forget, Marv Wolfman also had that series Night Force for DC, which was based on a group of occult magicians. It didn't really do very well. It only lasted a couple of issues, but that was probably based a lot on some of his personal experiences. He also wrote the Dracula Doctor Strange story, the Montrese formula, where Marvel wanted to get rid of all the vampires, so he has Doctor Strange team up with Hannibal King and Blade and recite this spell that kills every vampire. Of course, they've since revamped that and retconned it, but it was pretty good story.
That was heavy stuff. I remember when I was a kid and tracking down those issues and people talking about them, in hushed tones. I grew up in Salem, Massachusetts, so it's no small feat to impress the little warlocks in the neighborhood, and right down the street from the Parker Brothers factory where the Ouija boards were made and mass produced. But the interesting thing, and you touched on this, is that when you talk about the 1940s and Dr. Fate and the whole Egypt thing, Carter had just 20 years earlier stormed into Egypt, and by the 1940s there was this incredible nostalgia for Egyptian fashion that had started to happen. And so you have a little bit of that probably feeds into a little bit of the character. But also at that time, and you mentioned this, Crowley was considered the wickedest man alive, was in the middle of a libel suit in England, and it was starting to make headlines across in the United States, mainly in tabloids. And if we mentioned Kenneth Anger by mistake earlier, but he becomes pretty prescient to this because it was Kenneth Anger's Hollywood Babylon that kind of opened up the tabloid format in novelization form. And it was such a huge hit. I can't even imagine how many printings it's been through, but that he taps into those types of headlines that weren't appropriate for major newspapers. They weren't going to make the front page of the big city newspapers, but in the tabloids and in the detective magazines that were in every supermarket in the country, probably bought mainly by old ladies, you would catch stories like this, that they would make their way into, the zeitgeist, I guess, of the middle class, of the bourgeois. And by the 60s, it's LSD, psychedelia, and how that was used to open up people's chamber of thought. And so there became a new interest in paganism, in magic, and the occult, and that type of thing. So what do you think is the bridge there?
That whole thing kind of reminds me of Neil Gaiman's Sandman #1 story arc, where Sandman is captured by, I forgot the name of the guy, but he's kind of a Crowley archetype. He's leading a whole group of kids, and it follows him through the aeons, through the various decades, from the beginnings, through the 60s and 70s, and how the crowds of people that came to him differed. And of course, he had Morpheus trapped in that bubble. And anyways, if you go
in
back
the first 6 issues of Sandman, which were Norm Dringenberg, Sam Keith illustrating for Neil Gaiman.
Yes.
I loved Sam Keith as an artist. I thought he was a wonderful Wrightson imitator, and I was a huge Wrightson fan. But I didn't think that series really got rolling until it started tackling, the serial killer convention of Doll's House and that type of thing. Yes. But you're right. Those early issues were kind of like an intelligent way to say, okay, this is where this comes from in a real world kind of context, but it's still fantasy, and now we're going to get deep.
But I think to answer your question, though, in the 40s, I kind of feel that a lot of the superhero characters responding to the war and all this were about, alienation or alien forces bestowing power upon the characters. And then you had the 50s and the atomic era, where people became irradiated with power. But it was also in that time that you had EC comics out there, and you had all of the EC comics with their gratuitous violence and everything, but they also had all of these occult elements. They had witches, but instead of these witches were evil hags.
Yeah.
They had ghouls and
cannibalism,
zombies,
yep.
and all of this. So, the horror element in that was more shock movie kind of gore.
What you couldn't get in the cinema at that time, you could get in a comic book, and that's something that Frederick Wortham really chastised the comic industry for in his Seduction of the Innocent. We talked about that a little bit with Steve Bissett in one of the very early versions of this podcast. And I guess what Wortham's big objection was to all of that violence and all the occult stuff was that it was mass marketed to children. And apparently he was a huge fan of the zines and a huge fan of underground comics, which were, much worse in their content to a quiet, a sort of milquetoast America than were the ECs. But that he felt that it was because it was mass produced, because it was these big companies that were using this as a product to sell what he considered to be junk to kids, that he had a problem with it. But you're right, that those things, and I mean, I loved digging through old comic book boxes and would pray, that I would come across some old ECs, that I'd come across, Tales from the Crypt, or more, Vault of Horror and Haunt of Fear, which was my favorite because Ghastly Graham Ingalls was drawing the really scary stuff. But even the shock suspense stories, which was their detective fiction kind of thing, would have a lot of really racy stuff in it.
Well, these comics before the Code were bringing not only the occult in there, but they were bringing a lot of sex into the comics. You had the Headlight books with the women with the very protruding breasts, which date back to the pulps as well, because most of the pulps, even though I guarantee most of the audience for pulps at the time were probably male, had the scantily clad woman on the cover, and
the Sheena type Jungle Queen.
Yeah. But the elements of sexuality, the elements of the occult, like these monsters, I think these were the seeds. But as the 60s came in and you had the underground culture start exploring drugs and the psychedelic experience, that kind of merged with all of these other things and perpetuated the idea of the occult into books in the 70s and 80s with Marv Wolfman and Alan Moore, and then later in the 90s with Grant Morrison bringing actual chaos magic rituals and sigils and, talk about tantric illumination and all from Promethea, into the books, and then it became,
and Rogan Gosh, actually, from Brandon
McCarthy,
yep.
yes, and I think that's when it became really overt. Whereas before, it might have been hinted at, it might have been used as a story device. In the 90s and the early O's or aughts, with writers like Grant Morrison and I guess to a point Neil Gaiman as well, you're talking about it directly. Whereas before it was maybe hinted at, there might have been a character that was sort of the Crowleyan archetype. With Grant Morrison and John Constantine, you're actually meeting up with Aleister Crowley or characters of that nature. They're actually in the story, or in Grant Morrison's case, he's writing himself into the story as a proponent of all of this.
It's funny that, Jamie Delano, who would write the first maybe 17 issues of Hellblazer, with John Constantine, he was one of these other respected English writers that came over in that first wave. So when you had Alan Moore and, the rush of talent that came over after Alan Moore was Pete Milligan and Brendan McCarthy, Grant Morrison, and Jamie Delano was one of them. This is before Garth Ennis made his way over. So Jamie was kind of tasked with this impossible task of writing a comic based on a character previously written by Alan Moore. And having talked with Steve Bissette many, many times in this issue, and easily Totleben and Bissette put as much into that character as did Alan Moore, it still fell flat. It was also still newsprint, I think, when it was first coming out. It hadn't transitioned off into Baxter yet. And so the bright colors that were in a dark book were somewhat off-putting to people who would become fans of the Vertigo line. And while these titles were on the street, they didn't get sort of umbrellaed with the Vertigo label until I think Doom Patrol was in 50 issues on. Shade the Changing Man was probably well into the 30s, issue-wise. Swamp Thing was, had long since not been an Alan Moore title, I believe.
Well, I think the Vertigo books came about as a positive response from the adult readership and the people who are into the occult and all of these other things, realizing, hey, wait a minute, these comics aren't just a bunch of superheroes in tights beating the hell out of each other. They're actually talking about more significant and interesting things that might relate to what they were relating to. So they decided to make it its own brand, I guess.
Karen Berger had been fighting to separate her British boys from the rest of the DC Comics line because they hated getting tasked with sticking superheroes into their comics.
Is there any, I don't know, you've probably read more modern Vertigo stuff than I have. Is there anything lately that they've put out that is of note that might be of the same kind of thing? Because quite honestly, because I've been so focused on Doctor Strange stuff, it's been tough to keep up with Vertigo. I know they've had some troubles lately in really keeping that kind of readership alive because there hasn't really been a new Sandman, although I guess Neil Gaiman is writing new Sandman, and that the new series actually is really good. I really like it. It's beautiful art, and the story itself is a very metaphysical story. But it's there have been seeds throughout comic history of, especially in the horror books, even in DC's House of Mystery and House of Secrets and Secrets of the Haunted House, all that had this occult element. But I think it was really with Vertigo, with these guys we're talking about now, that it really came out as being a not only story device, but a way of almost bridging this comic book reality with the reality you and I are actually living in, and making the stories within these books transcend just being part of this imaginary DC or Marvel universe and actually coming into the reality as we know it. And magic is a good way to have that bridge occur, because although Marvel is more focused on science and mutation and everything, and we could see certain elements of that in our society. We see certain things that look kind of like Iron Man. We see certain people that may demonstrate different abilities.
It's still hard to explain away Thor.
Yeah, yeah. And, one way to do that is by bringing in this ritual magic thing. So it's always kind of been in the peripheral of comic books.
I always kind of like, too, this was something that I think started to take seed a little bit with Wally Wood's run on the Doctor Doom stories in the back of Tales to Astonish.
Astonishing Tales.
Astonishing Tales, you're right. And where they kind of laid out the groundwork for Doctor Doom to not have just been cosmically affected by the same rays that, mutated the Fantastic Four, but that he became this character that had an interest in mystical or otherwise occulted knowledge.
And the best example of someone using that history of Doctor Doom is Stern and Mignola's Triumph and Torment graphic novel, where Doctor Doom and Doctor Strange go to hell to rescue Doctor Doom's mom from Mephisto, which is basically
the Marvel Universe.
The Marvel
Satan,
Universe
really.
Satan, right,
Yeah.
right. And that's a beautiful, beautiful graphic novel. And I think that was Kirby that first started him on the occult path, because they had his whole origin story tied into him studying the occult as well as science. And I think it was only later in the movies that they had Doctor Doom on the spaceship along with the other guys getting irradiated. But that was an early development in that supervillain's history. And Wally Wood, certainly those stories are great. They're beautifully illustrated, and I think they just reprinted Triumph and Torment in a graphic novel, a little book-sized,
like a trade.
Yeah, a trade, and it has some of those Astonishing Tales, or at least one of those Astonishing Tales stories reprinted in the back as well. So that's definitely worth checking out. And, Mike Mignola and Hellboy and all of that is another person who used a lot of these tropes very overtly. There was a lot. I know Hellboy's mentor is kind of based on Charles Fort. They made him look like Charles Fort, and even in the first Seed of Destruction story, they had the frogs raining down. So there's a lot of that comes into it. And Charles Fort, you can't really deny his influence on almost all of the occult writings after him.
You're gonna have to explain Charles Fort to the listeners.
Well, Charles Fort was a fellow. He only wrote 4 books, but I guess his most well-known book's called Book of the Damned, and he would sit in a library and look through all of these news stories in French and in English for any kind of weird anomaly that actually occurred and was written about in a newspaper. If it ever rained frogs, or if it ever rained fish, if there was ever some kind of weird hybrid animal mutation that was born somewhere, he would write about all of these things. He was basically collecting all of these stories for this
cryptozoology type thing.
Cryptozoology has a lot, and so a lot of these, the idea of the phenomenal and the unbelievable and the unexplained actually occurring in reality, we have a lot to thank Charles Fort for, because that was his forte, really, is collecting all of these stories. And
no pun intended.
That's right. But so I mean, Mignola picked up on that, and there's a lot of occult stuff in his Hellboy books, of course, and the whole trope about the Nazis working with the occult and all of that.
Which brings us back to Peter Levenda. And actually the title of his book on the Typhonian tradition and magic is called The Dark Lord, and a highly recommended reading. But of course it was Peter Levenda who wrote one of the very early nonfiction books on the actual expeditions of the Nazis into Tibet and their connection to a belief system that makes them not just the SS weren't just a bad bunch of guys. They were a cult within a force for evil in the world. And Levenda's book Unholy Alliance, I think, bears a foreword by, oh my goodness,
Can't think of it.
I can't think of his name. I can't think of his name.
We should have these, we should have these things nearby for reference.
Well, this is how people know that what we do is just, this is real podcasting here.
Well,
it's not
it's funny
really slick. It's not really very well arranged. Although I'm very, very happy to have the guests that I have.
Well, you can even go into the Marvel movies then with the Nazis and their occult thing, and the Captain America movie. They're trying to associate.
That's straight out of Ratline.
Yeah, but the thing is, they're trying to associate these occult connections with the Nazis. Of course, they're called Hydra in the movie, but like the Nazis.
Yeah, I mean,
they're trying to make it as they're trying to
the Odessa.
Well, they're trying to link it with the Asgardian world more than they are with the idea of the occult. So it's going to be interesting when Doctor Strange comes out how they're going to tackle that. If they're
Norman Mailer wrote the foreword to Unholy Alliance.
There you go. I was going to say what?
Yes.
All in the Family? What?
Not Norman Lear, but you talk about, and that's actually going to be a theme for one of the future podcasts, is that I want to get Peter Levenda on to have him talk about how based in reality Hydra is. That this idea of these post-war Nazis that kind of got ingratiated to, American government and other governments is a very real thing. And I mean, it was sort of fringe literature 35 years ago. Now there's a lot of books being written by a lot of academics that are like, there was the monastery route through Rome, through the Vatican. A lot of these really bad Nazi guys made it down to South America. But the U.S. government took on about 1,000 of them, to work on the Manhattan Project as part of Project Paperclip.
Paperclip, yeah.
So all these Paperclip Nazis were living in the southwestern United States. And certainly there's a lot of German-looking buildings in Pasadena. But I'm going to take this moment to take a little break, and we're going to be right back.
When you get to Hitler, you know that you've gone...
You've gone a little bit too far abreast of things. But we're going to take a little break, hear another word from some of our amazing sponsors and some about the amazing events that we have here on the Meltdown cast. And we'll be right back with Howard Hallis on Pod Sequentialism. This is Matt Kennedy. See you in a few moments.
Melt You, the school at Meltdown, where they teach you the skills to make comic books. Some of the current classes include creating comics, drawing comics for kids, and the art of inking. Coming soon, there will be classes for short film writing, drawing basics, and kids make zines. Go to meltcomics.com and enroll now.
Welcome back. This is Matt Kennedy. You're listening to Pod Sequentialism. I have with me a wonderful guest, Mr. Howard Hallis. Aside from being an authority on Doctor Strange and having more than layman's knowledge on mysticism in comics, Howard is also quite adept in lenticular, has exhibited in museum spaces, in fine art galleries, and has been an educator and just an all-around really great guy. So I want to thank him for coming on the show.
Thank you, Matt.
And we're gonna dig a little deeper now. We've talked a little bit about the origins of the use of mystical characters in comics, and we started talking about how when you get into the Avengers, really, and Captain America, and of course Captain America being a creation of World War II. And how there's been this recasting of certain other Marvel characters to feed into this more real-world mix of mysticism and narcissism, I guess. And with the Nazis, make such great villains, of course, because they were horrible people. that you see an expressed interest in this kind of Raiders of the Lost Ark type of fundamental adventure story. It's like the good against evil. It's like,
Well, they've done that, but they've also expanded it, because I think when you had Spielberg making movies like Raiders of the Lost Ark, you had the Nazis as the villains and Indiana Jones as the good guy. But Marvel has done a pretty good job with their films and with the TV show Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. as showing Hydra to be more of an anomaly.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that, yes, is fundamentally evil, but it infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D. to the point where you don't really know who's a good guy or a bad guy. Things may not be so black and white now. And I know that they used Hydra in Captain America because I don't think they wanted to have swastikas
on American comics, yeah.
But the funny thing about that is, now you see all these memes where you have like Trump whispering "Hail Hydra," and it may backfire ultimately in the same way that you had V for Vendetta masks in the comics actually becoming the symbol of Anonymous in real life. Maybe soon you'll actually be seeing people
wearing Hydra gear
or perpetuating that whole idea.
Yeah.
And whereas Hydra were pretty much one-dimensional villains
originally, for sure. I think when Ed Brubaker took on the Captain America title, and I think that was following his Daredevil run, which was a brilliant Daredevil run. He sort of, he used Hydra as the main engine of the death of a very major Marvel character, and there's no spoilers, and I think anybody who'd be listening to this knows that storyline is called The Death of Captain America, and indeed Captain America was killed, and it sent shockwaves throughout comics. I had been out of comics when that happened, and when I heard that they were killing off Captain America, I thought it was just a really crass example of merchandising happening. And then I read the story, and I was like, oh my God, this is really well done.
Well, in a way, it was definitely well done, but it's also, no one really dies in comic books.
Yeah, even Bucky came back.
So,
even the rule that established that nobody stays dead in comics except Bucky, and then they went and ruined that. But they didn't ruin it. They brought him back brilliantly.
Yes, they did, as Winter Soldier. And you were talking about Doctor Doom earlier and his mystical aspirations. If you're reading the latest Secret War, he is now God Supreme of the Marvel Universe. So, they
happily I'm not reading Secret Wars. I didn't enjoy the first one. I didn't read the second one, and I'll probably never go back to read anything bearing that title. I understand it is a huge touchstone for the generation just behind me.
Well, we'll see. I mean,
mainly for the toys, I think.
Yeah, I guess so. It's with comics, so especially with Marvel and DC's mainstays, their
Remember
big
Contest
guns.
of Champions?
Oh, of course. That was the predecessor to all that.
Yeah.
But in a way, it's also these otherworldly, godlike forces intervening and forcing these characters to do battle. And the idea of bringing a deity-like entity into comics is sort of aligned with the occult and mysticism in a way,
in a representational way. But I think it's also a bit of just the next great step in, and I don't mean great in that it's a good thing, but just in the size of the step, a great stride in the kind of hyperbolic language of comics that, once you get into the business of killing off main characters doesn't mean anything anymore. When you've got movies and video games vying for kids' attention, and you know that the readership has been declining for the past 20 years, 30 years, you know that, you got to take that next big step. Like what can shock, or in lieu of shock, because I think the need for outright shock value left comics in the 90s. With Tim Vigil's Faust, and then EO was kind of like, okay, how do we shock people after this? And Glenn Danzig launching Verotic and hiring people like Hart Fisher to write some pretty amazing and extreme stuff in the context of those comics, push the envelope even further. But
Yeah, Gus was very bloody. I
Yeah, yeah. And when you've got the superheroes in films now topping the box office, what can you get in a comic that you know you can't put in the movie? You can start crossing into quasi-religious territory, and you can become a little bit of a provocateur in that way, where it's like, hey, we used to have the argument, who'd win in a fight, Superman or the Hulk? That was like the big discussion in the 70s. You'd hear it in comic shops well up into the 80s. And it's like, well, God could beat Superman. God could beat, the Hulk. And I think it was really great that in the 80s, Jim Starlin answered that question for us in a way that I don't think we felt until Morrison did All-Star Superman. It's like, cancer can kill Captain Marvel. That makes, this fantasy idea of these superpowered people with unrealistic proportions realistic again, because they're vulnerable to the same things that we're vulnerable to. And I think that the only way to make giants look small is to find a bigger giant. And what's a bigger giant than whatever deity you want to throw out there?
Sure.
And when you're dealing with pantheons like we have been and have been rebuilding again, I mean, even in the new Frank Quitely series, which is basically about Olympians, that, you're rebuilding off of these old kind of pagan pantheons as modern superheroes, which they are in a lot of ways. What trumps that? Monotheism. And so, what trumps monotheism? Buddhism, I guess, so.
They had the Savage Dragon. Eric Larson had him fighting God.
Yep.
And one of those issues. And so God has actually, the Judeo-Christian
Yahweh.
Yeah. He's appeared in comics from time to time. And there's, you mentioned that, there's comics now based on the Olympians becoming superheroes. Well, even the Percy Jackson books had that going on, and that's very popular among the kids. And
YA fiction.
Among the young kids, they love the Percy Jackson. I'm sorry. But,
we talked about that actually with Ave Rose, and the fact that, the young adult novels have kind of usurped the position that comic books had.
If you want to talk about the most popular magical ritual, I mean, Harry Potter is really a huge catalyst in introducing that kind of world to kids, but of course,
thus hated by evangelicals, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, well, it's. But it's
I don't think they make up a large portion of my audience, so we can feel free to poke fingers here and
there's
there.
also this removal from reality. As much as we don't want to be muggles and actually use magic in the way they do in those books, it's not really the same type of ritual magic that Grant Morrison and all these guys are talking about.
It's still Disneyfied,
Yeah, I mean, there's no sexual component or it's very subtle if there's any of that there at all.
Yeah, there's Disney goth, and then there's the Fields of the Nephilim.
There you go. Yeah.
There's the kids in their Jack Skellington shirts, and then there's the people who know, the real goth stuff.
But I'm not going to say it's a gateway in the same way marijuana is a gateway to heroin or anything.
Right.
But it's certainly a way of introducing kids to mysticism in a way that is kind of appealing and interesting, and people are fascinated to read about the goings-on in Hogwarts. And
well, certainly it's positive fantasy, and while it does have its darkness, that's much more tied to personal story, which is why those books work, which is why that they've been so phenomenally popular, and why, I don't think we've seen J.K. write the last Harry Potter book.
Well, yeah, a few years are going to go by, and she's going to be like, well,
it's right about the parents. Yeah,
But, in Marvel, it's funny, they had this series in the 90s that was pretty much created for sales only. It was the Marvel versus DC books, which, answered the question, who would win in a fight, Superman or the Hulk? But the reason I bring that up isn't because I want to bring it up for the fact that they answered that question, but for the fact that at the end of that series, these super deities appeared. There was a super deity for the Marvel universe and a super deity for the DC universe that merged together to become the amalgam deity. But I found that fascinating because, in a way, the writers of this series, which for all intents and purposes was kind of silly. It was like a contest of champions type of thing. But at the end of this, these deities were the personification of God, for the most part, in the Marvel and DC universes. And they've never really been that literal since then. Mm-hmm. But it's fascinating. If you look at issue number 4 of the Marvel versus DC thing, you'll see these giant entities that are supposed to... this
kind of transfiguration moment, which is... I guess paramount to the giant Egyptian statues that made the tours in the museums in the 70s.
Right. So in a way, even in these trite stories, you're getting certain elements of the supernatural, the occult, the religious, I guess. And I guess there's a fine line between that because...
I'm wondering how long it's going to be before they revamp Omega the Unknown.
Yeah.
That's a very well-regarded comic now by people who are writing comics and were reading comics then.
He wasn't around too long. That's Steve Gerber's
and it was a really fast in and out series. It was done, really before it got going, but it was tackling some pretty sophisticated
I'll have to go
concepts.
reread it. I know he was in the Defenders issues. But
because he's sharing space with Doctor Strange.
Right.
Some people may not know this. Howard has one of the definitive collections of Doctor Strange memorabilia.
It's funny. I actually wrote into Guinness to see if I can get the world's record of the largest Doctor Strange collection in the world. I think I might get it.
All right.
Get that title. I'm pretty excited. Well, I'll let you know.
Was the issue that it's too specific?
No, I'm still waiting to hear from them. There's a thing you can apply for a world record, and you could spend like £700, and they'll expedite it, and they'll let you know in like 2 weeks, or you could just send it in for free, and you have to wait like 3 months or something.
Right.
We'll see. I'll keep you posted.
Such a shame their museum is right down on Hollywood Boulevard.
Yeah. But yeah, I've been actively collecting that particular character, and we'll see what happens with that.
I gotta say, it makes Howard one of the most difficult people to buy gifts for because he's got it all.
Well, just don't buy me any Doctor Strange. But it's gotten to the point now of critical mass where there's now stuff coming out. If I continue it, it's going to be too expensive because, after the movie comes out, you're going to have your $20,000 Doctor Strange slot machines in Vegas with Benedict Cumberbatch's face on it. And by the time that kind of stuff starts happening, it's impossible to
have
accumulate
everything
as much as I have.
So. There was a point, I think it was probably 22 years ago, when Gaston, who owns Meltdown Comics and Collectibles, he and I were roommates in the early 90s. And when he moved from the shop that we both worked at to the first Meltdown, which is across the street from where it currently is.
I went there.
Yep. And then we moved 2 doors down. It was initially right next to Thai iced tea place, not Toy on Sunset, but another place which was, I think, called Thai iced tea. It moved 2 doors down. It was there for quite a while, and then it came over here. But I remember that Leonardo DiCaprio was being approached for the role of the adult but younger Darth Vader, so Anakin Skywalker. And he came in and was asking about a collection of every Star Wars toy. And I was like, well, yeah, I can probably get that for you. And at that point, it was still possible. That the amount of original Star Wars merchandise only went up till droids, I guess, at that point. Mm-hmm. And of course, 2 of the more expensive and impossible to find Star Wars toys are droids-backed cards. But and I think he wanted everything sealed, everything on card. And so we kind of just spit out a number. It's like, I think we could probably get that for you for $1 million. Mm-hmm. And he wasn't moved by that. And and then he didn't take the role, and then it didn't happen. But by the time that second set of movies came out, it was impossible. they had taken every bit of merchandising that they had done in the first film and just gone to the nth degree with it. And certainly, yeah, there were slot machines and all types of things that you wouldn't think would be necessarily associated with a movie primarily aimed at teenagers.
I know there's still some guy out there somewhere that has a huge warehouse full of Star Wars stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder how complete that collection is even now, because, yeah, Lord knows it's...
You got to give up at a certain point. You have to tap out.
Right. But it's been really fun, and it's fascinating to get into one character to that point. And I think it was Genesis Piorge that really got me started on Doctor Strange, because we were talking about comic books and superheroes over at Leary's house when he was up there, and he was like, Howard, I love Doctor Strange because whereas all these other superheroes are fighting bad guys trying to rob banks, Doctor Strange is going into other dimensions and meeting up with characters called Eternity, who is the eternal embodiment of everything.
It's a pretty spot-on Genesis imitation for those who have not had the pleasure. I actually also spent a little less time with Genesis and Dr. Leary around that same era, and just saw Genesis perform with his band Psychic TV last week. By the time the show airs, that will already have been several months ago, but it won't be too soon, I think, to catch the last Psychic TV show, because they're touring into 2016. It's an incredible experience. Genesis is a very important counterculture character, credited with helping to develop industrial music with his first group, Come, and then Throbbing Gristle helped to really pioneer noise and simultaneously acid disco. And Psychic TV are now kind of in their post-psychedelic revival phase. They opened their show the other night with a mashup of Interstellar Overdrive with the lyrics of Astronomy Domine from Pink Floyd. And which
would
has
have
also
been
been
interesting to see. Yeah.
Yeah.
I know they also did set the controls for the. Genesis is a fascinating individual, and it's a shame
kind of a real magician.
Yeah, it's a shame Jason Louv, who was supposed to be here today, didn't come by, because he's definitely a lot better versed on the Temple of Psychic Youth and Genesis's writings than I am. But he spent a lot of time over there. He's the guy who edited the Psychic Bible.
Yeah,
but
for Pharaoh House too. Yeah,
but it's also worthy of bringing up Genesis in relation to comics, not just because he really kind of was the impetus for me getting into Doctor Strange, but also because of his transformation into sort of an omnisexual being. He was married to this woman who's since passed away, and they decided while she was alive to become
the same person.
Right.
Yeah.
He got breast augmentations and all these other things to kind of transform into her.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Jason Louv would also agree that that's kind of part of this whole ritual magic evolution to get to this state of this omnisexual type being.
Its own type of transfiguration.
There's only been a few touches of that in the comics. I know the character of Desire in The Endless that Neil Gaiman wrote about. I know that in The Invisibles, Morrison had the was it Ragged Robin, or was Ragged Robin his wife? I don't know. He had a transvestite character in there, and it's kind of worth noting as sort of a side note that that's sort of related, at least peripherally, to the whole magical idea. And
the hermaphroditic nature of motherness.
There, you also have Calistrogo from the League of Extraordinary Gentlemen that Alan Moore wrote about. So, that's becoming a trope now as well. So, these magical elements are filtering in to the comic book world, especially through these channels, through these writers and artists who know about all of this stuff.
And for anybody who wants to go deeper on the subject, some of the books that we discussed were, of course, Peter Levenda has written a lot on a variety of kind of taboo subjects. We mentioned Unholy Alliance, which is his book about the Project Paperclip and the mystical pursuits of the Nazis. and his book The Dark Lord, which is about the Typhonian tradition that ties Aleister Crowley to H.P. Lovecraft. And I know Howard had brought with him a book called Mutants and Mystics by Jeffrey Cripple. Yeah. And it looks to be very, very good reading.
It's interesting. The fellow wrote this. It's sort of like his dissertation paper, and his whole idea is that comics, pulps, and all of this metaphysical literature are creating what's known as sort of a super story, that all of these titles are interconnected through various common tropes.
That sounds like the cliff notes for the forthcoming Alan Moore book Jerusalem, which he's been promising us for about 25 years, which is also sort of a game that it comes with a board game in which when you roll the dice, the act of rolling the dice casts a spell. And the validity of which I think will attest to the belief of the user.
Let's hope it works better than Grant Morrison designing sigils for that Robbie Williams record, which didn't do very well.
The Robbie Williams. Maybe that was his intent. Take money from the man, but don't give him any fame.
There you go.
But of course, he's done much better in his performances with My Chemical Romance, who are now, I think, on hiatus, while comic author and performer Gerard Way is embarking on his own solo career, which Grant has also been very much a part of. And I'm sure we'll have Grant on one of these days when I can secure him for 45 minutes. But that's going to bring this episode to a close. This has been kind of a longer episode for us, but I think well worth it. Hope everybody else has been as gratified as I to have Howard Hallis on. And Howard, why don't you shout out some websites for people so they can see what you're doing? Before I hand this over to him, you should be aware that Howard Hallis is the man who created The Picture of Everything, which was covered by Wired magazine. It is getting an extension. It is a huge piece of incredible detail, one of the most impressive things I've ever had the joy to exhibit. And, hit us with some websites.
Yeah, you could see that at thepictureofeverything.com. You can go to my website at howardhallis.com, and my last name is spelled Hallis, so howardhallis.com. I'm also in the process of updating my Doctor Strange collection website, and we're looking at maybe November or December for a huge update of that.
That'll be live by the time this runs.
Yeah, so I might get a new URL for that. In the meantime, you'll be able to find it through howardhallis.com.
Perfect. So again, I want to thank everybody for tuning in again to Pod Sequentialism. I am your host, Matt Kennedy, and until next time, let's keep reading some comics.
And may your amulet never tickle.